Welcome to the first video of what I'm calling the first pass. These are videos about the CBS knowledge standards. And just to remind you, recently in CBS, there were a set of standards proposed as a consensus document for international training and supervision in CBS therapies, including ACT and FAP and other contextual approaches. And so we now have these new knowledge standards and there's quite a lot. You could spend hours and probably years unpacking the nuances of these things, and we don't want to do that. What I want to do is kind of quickly cover the points as best I can so that you have a good grounding to start understanding some of the key philosophical and methodological issues in using CBS therapies like ACT. And then from there, you may want to do additional kind of supplementary reading or deepen your understanding. But hopefully, this is useful to get you going kind of in a good direction. Skip over some of the things that are hard to see very close up to the text. So, big picture, key ideas, so that you can understand what is happening inside of modern contextual behavioral therapies. So I won't review all these right now, but I just wanted to show you the 15 different knowledge-based standards that have been identified. These tend to be in the area of kind of history and theory, and then understanding assessment and methodology in intervention for CBS therapies. So those are the 15 that we will try to touch on with these videos. Today, I want to try to cover two. So knowledge standard 2 and 3, giving an accessible understanding of how modern contextually focused approaches have grown out of the history of behavioral science. Some of the key things that came out of those early efforts, as well as understanding what's been called the three different waves of behavioral therapy. So as we dive right into the three waves, what this kind of view is was proposed by Steve Hayes many years ago, now about 20 years ago, and not everybody agrees, not everybody likes the three waves of therapy, but it is important, and you will hear a lot of folks in the CBS world talk about it. And really, what Steve was saying in the paper and then presentations about that is that there are waves, meaning there was a particular kind of focus area, shared assumptions. We see this with all kinds of generations of psychotherapies and things like that. But that there was an early generation, the first behaviorists, and then that over time there was a kind of a tension or challenges that came up in applying it in sort of the first wave way. So a second wave developed that incorporated some of the first wave and then added some of its own features. And then even those, after some decades, started to have their own challenges or there were new areas. And so then a third wave emerged that had kind of new, totally different, kind of assumptions and focus areas. And it's not a, it's not an easy thing to call a wave. So some people have pitched a fourth wave, and mostly I know Steve has been not supportive of that. Doesn't really see a sea change calling for a fourth wave at this point. But these three waves work together and integrate, and together become basically the history of modern behavioral therapy. So if we dive right into the first wave, what is this? This is in the 1900s up through about the 1950s. And remember, at that time, behavior principles were new. We had Pavlov and Thorndike and folks that were investigating behavioral principles. And there was interest in applying these clinically right away. And really as an alternative to the kind of psychoanalytic um, establishment that was there from Freud. So these early first waivers were basically taking the principles that were being discovered in the laboratory and trying to use them to treat clinically useful things like fear. And these were pretty kind of first order changes, meaning they were using they're going after behaviors that seem to be maybe supported by these fear responses, and they were trying to kind of desensitize them out and directly kind of change the fear response. So kind of very first order change. And the psychoanalysts at the time thought that what they thought basically would happen was symptom substitution. So they would say that doesn't really count once you change the one, direct behavior. This underlying kind of unconscious drive is going to show up in some other place, and these people are going to continue to have problems. And that largely didn't turn out to be true. It turns out that if people are having kind of specific kind of phobias or other kinds of aversions, and you can treat them with behavior therapy, they tend to get better at those things, right? And those don't necessarily show up in other separate ways. But the early behavior therapy didn't solve all of the problems. In this era, we're looking at folks like John B. Watson, um, Mary Cover Jones, known as the mother of behavior therapy. She treated a boy named Peter with a fear of rabbits just using direct conditioning, using kind of positive association while he was being exposed in the presence of rabbits, and then he became less afraid of rabbits. Later, we had Joseph Wolpe with systematic desensitization, and that was kind of an extension of what Mary Cover Jones was doing. That included things that would be pretty familiar to modern behavior therapists, like making a fear hierarchy and doing gradual exposure to things on that hierarchy, as well as things like relaxation training and assertiveness training. I've got Watson in here. He said many more reasonable things, but I did want to highlight this quote about give me a dozen healthy infants and I can basically turn them into whatever I want. Part of what we want to appreciate in this transition or historical look is this move towards behavior therapies becoming more compassionate and person-centered. And some of the early behavior therapies, remember this is the era of the 1920s when there's eugenics and lots of social and class, you know, dimensions that weren't really recognized, that were sort of those were sort of localized in people, not in the context so much at that time. And so there were quite paternalistic things that were said by folks that were still intending to be helpful and deliver alleviation of suffering. So we have this very bold claim by Watson, and then we have folks doing some of the early work to try to make lives better for people using those kind of new and direct principles of behavior therapy. And so there's a couple key figures that we associate with the first wave of behavioral therapy. The first is John B. Watson. We saw this before, known for methodological behaviorism, right? And so in methodological behaviorism, that is where we are really treating overt behavior as kind of the main thing that is allowed to be a focus. And this is a little bit of an overstatement, but basically banning kind of introspection or those kinds of unobserved private events. We've got B.F. Skinner. We'll talk about a little bit more in a second about how radical behaviorism addressed this problem differently. And we also had J.R. Cantor, who may not be that familiar to folks, kind of a quiet figure in some ways, but also good to know, especially if you do some deeper reading into more modern CBS literature. J.R. Cantor's interbehaviorism is coming back. There's a lot of folks interested in that as an alternative or a complement to the Skinnerian work that is already in CBS quite a lot. So wanted to highlight J.R. Cantor as somebody that you might see. Watson is sort of the person that we're going to sort of leave behind. And then B.F. Skinner is someone that is going to kind of stick around and really have a strong influence on CBS. But I think the other thing to highlight here is, even though they were different theorists and they disagreed with each other, they were unified at that time in wanting a natural science of behavior. And in terms of psychology and clinical work, really wanted to make sure that that was distinct from the psychoanalyst. So they were joined kind of in this common purpose at first, and then as time passed, these differences became more pronounced, and they went down different paths in terms of pushing psychology and clinical work forward. Okay, one slide to talk about some key stuff with B.F. Skinner and radical behaviorism. So basically, to situate this, it's the late 30s, it's into the 40s, and psychologists are having a fight. And like any good academic fight, they're going to have a symposium and they're going to write papers and they're going to critique each other in these papers. So that's what they did. They had this symposium on operationism, and basically what they were struggling with was sort of like how do you get really kind of like objective definitions of things in psychology, like what do we really mean by definition, and how do we how do we kind of carry that forward in a way so we can be scientists. So there was a big focus on kind of modeling themselves after the physical science, like in physics, where you have these standard units of like time and length, right? And then you can use them to create these constructs like velocity and acceleration, very very kind of objective scientific pieces, which were important for the development of modern physics. And that's kind of what they wanted to do for a while in psychology. Is like, let's get to the real objective good science bit of psychology. And it's complicated, right? It's pretty hard to have technical definitions of things like attention and consciousness and things like that. So that's what they'd been fighting about. They came to the symposium, and this was Skinner's contribution, this paper, The Operational Analysis of Psychological Terms, his contribution to the symposium. And it's the first time where he sort of publicly announces the break from earlier methodological behaviorism from Watson and those folks. So this is the first kind of public announcement of this, and the first time the term radical behaviorism has been introduced. There's a lot of things going on in that paper, but one of the big ones is Skinner wants to argue that we're not just going to be limited to overt behavior. He wants to make a place for private behavior. So those are things that are behaviors that are maybe not publicly observable by others. So these include thoughts and feelings, and he gives the example here of someone experiencing toothache. And so what his big claim is that we are not supposed to focus on kind of coming up with the right definitions and then applying them from this kind of outside perspective. Instead, our main job, right, what we need to do with these psychological terms is we've got to give a behavioral account of what is controlling the verbalization of the term. So in other words, under what circumstances do people say things like, I have a toothache, right? Or under what circumstances do people say, I've become aware that I have a toothache? And that if we can understand these controlling conditions, we have, in a sense, explained what we need to do. And sometimes we're going to have like a single definition, like only one set of controlling um, conditions. And in other cases, the same term might have multiple controlling conditions, and it might sort of mean different things, just in the same way that we might use the word length to mean different things in different contexts, even in physics. So big shift, right? It's about kind of explaining how it is that people use these terms, and that's what the game is. And this is where the term radical comes. So radical means it's going to be thoroughgoing, whole, fundamental, a natural science of behavior that's going to include both public and private events. And the idea that as scientists, they're not going to be able to step out and sort of pick the right perspective. They are having verbal behavior too. They have private events and verbal behavior as well. And so what they are doing is part of the analysis. In other words, part of what the game is going to be is understanding not only what is controlling a subject, an experiment, or a client saying, I have a toothache, but how are we going to account for the verbal behavior of a scientist going like, I now understand what awareness is. I now have a good account of a consciousness. That's a verbal behavior itself that's going to be subject to analysis. And so we're not going to ever be able to sort of step out of this game of just looking at what is controlling the sort of behavior of verbalizing this? And then, of course, we still want to do science. So some of those ways are going to be more or less helpful. So we're going to have to measure and sort of see what science is about and see if some ways of talking are more helpful than others and measure that against other ways we have in science. But it's within itself. Is kind of going everywhere, going to the private event, and it's going to all of the social contexts of client and subject and experimenter and scientific community. And the other thing that is really cool about this is Skinner wants to explain how it is that that private events can come to be controlling. And what he describes is really the importance of the social verbal community, right? So he'll give the example of like if we're going to teach a kid about what toothaches are and to be able to verbalize them, have the concept of toothaches, we're going to do that in a couple of interesting ways. The first is we're not going to necessarily know what's happening on the inside, but we're also going to see what's happening on the outside that might be paired with, right, happening at the same time. So, for example, if a kid gets hit with a baseball right in the mouth, like we're going to assume that there's probably some pain in there, right? And we're going to use some coaching, right? Oh my gosh, does your tooth hurt? I bet your tooth hurts. Like we're teaching them this idea of pain in the tooth because it's accompanied with this kind of very observable uh, uh, pain, right? Or if we see them kind of grabbing their jaw, right, like this, we might go like, "Oh, your jaw hurts. Like, do you have pain in your tooth?" And it's not going to be 100% accurate. We don't know, but a lot of times, if we get the right kind of training, people are going to understand and be able to start describing their own private experience. So kids can be able to say, like, "Yeah, I have my tooth hurts. It's this tooth right here, not this one." They're going to start using that term toothache in the way that the social verbal community wants them to or has reinforced them to. And the same idea that happens with a toothache can be used for other kinds of thoughts and feelings, right? The feeling of being anxious, right? Feeling of being, upset, all that. And it can be used for very elaborate things. So it also applies to the scientist at the conference who's like, I've explained the neural basis of consciousness. All of those terms in there, neural basis, consciousness explained, all of these are subject to the same kind of social verbal reinforcement that shaped up our understanding of like simple things like red and blue and toothaches and anxiety and all that stuff. So that's what Skinner is up to in this account. And it's going to be what he does ongoing, really breaking from those methodological behaviors who say, if we can't see it, if we can't measure it, there's nothing there. He says here at the end very, very strongly, I contend that my toothache is just as physical as my typewriter, though not public, and I see no reason why an objective and operational science can't consider the process through which a vocabulary descriptive of toothache is acquired and maintained, right? So he's like, this stuff matters, right? And clinically, that's going to be really important too, because we care a lot about observable overt behavior. But that's not everything that we care about. We know what it's like to have private experiences. And we know that a lot of what brings our clients into work with us is what happens with those private experiences, those challenging thoughts and feelings and body sensations. And so having a science that is fully naturalistic, that is fully behavioral, not mentalistic, we don't switch over and take the mentalistic turn. We stay behavioral, but that can go anywhere inside or outside the skin and can go to any kind of complexity of language is basically the turn that Skinner is going to make. And it doesn't get all the way there. There are some problems that he's going to face and why he couldn't stand up kind of act back in 1945. But he's on the path and he paves the way forward for modern contextual behavioral scientists to pick up this operationalism in a way that is new and is strictly behavioral. And I want to read just one piece of the paper that's very cool to really reinforce what this sort of means and the importance of this social verbal community that we're in. So he says, the additional hypothesis follows quite naturally that being conscious as a form of reacting to one's own behavior is a social product. Verbal behavior may be distinguished and conveniently defined by the fact that the contingencies of reinforcement are provided by other organisms rather than by mechanical action upon the environment. The hypothesis is equivalent to saying that it is only because the behavior of the individual is important to society that society in turn makes it important to the individual. The individual becomes aware of what he is doing only after society has reinforced verbal responses with respect to his behavior. So there's this cool awareness of how we as social organisms kind of boot up language and cognition in each other, not so much by just interacting with the environment, but by the kind of reinforcement, the kind of social training that we give to people as they start to do this thing which we call talking and relating and understanding. And that's a very cool kind of constructivist view uh, in from 1945 that is going to get built out further into relational frame theory and into the modern CBS therapies. Okay, so we're still in the first wave with Skinner and radical behaviorism. And Skinner's going to continue in the 50s, kind of doing what he laid out in the 45 paper of analyzing some of these new verbal terms. And he's going to write a book in 1957 called Verbal Behavior. And he's going to identify several key uh, uh, behavioral concepts that are useful for what we would call everyday language, right? So he's going to identify things like a tact. Tact is basically describing things. So if I'm holding a cup, when I say I'm holding a cup, I'm tacting my holding of a cup. He's got things like mand, which comes kind of from the word demand. Demand is when people ask for things. So, please hand me the cup. So he's going to analyze this and several other kinds of basic verbal operants using his operant behavior analysis and this radical behavioral approach. And unsurprisingly, the first book, taking on language, does not solve the whole problem. So he can't quite solve the problem there, and he was pretty severely criticized, I think unfairly so, by Noam Chomsky and others. But there were real limitations about the generativity of this and helping people get to these very complicated kind of verbal networks. Um, that we see characteristic of verbal adults in psychotherapy. So he couldn't quite get all the way there. There has been some work, applied work called the VB map, that takes some of those basic operants like the tact and the mand, and that teach those to children that don't seem to be developing those just naturalistically. So there is some application, but again, you don't really see the generativity with those. So in one sense, that part of it is sort of going to stall the progress from the radical behaviorists. There were some later applications in the 70s of looking at sort of radical behavioral accounts of depression and things like that. But for a long time, it's gonna stagnate. And what's going to happen with radical behaviorism is there's the ABA folks, right? So showing you here the uh, key journal, JABA, Journal of Applied Behavioral Analysis, and the seminal article from 1968 defining the different definitions of what counts as applied behavioral analysis, Bear, Wolf, and Risley. So if you've got BCBA friends, they're going to know this stuff called, this is going to be kind of what they do. This really laid out the scope of practice and the definitions of what ABA work was and still is in a way. And so there were folks that were jumping into ABA world and trying to do lots of things. You can use ABA and in business settings and sports and all that. But over time, due to kind of financial and other historical forces, because ABA didn't have a very good account of very complex language, it didn't go into kind of the psychotherapy space. It really became kind of specialized for working with kids with developmental and intellectual disabilities, really into kind of autism world where we see it now. And so that's what ABA was doing because it didn't necessarily have an easy account of more complicated language repertoires that we could use in the clinic. So now we come to the second wave, roughly the 1960s through the 1990s, and it's still with us today, of course, because it gets assimilated. Some of the main figures that we think about in this era are Albert Bandura with social learning or social cognitive theory, most kind of famously known for the Bobo doll experiment. This is where adult experimenters show aggression towards the Bobo doll, and then when kids come in and interact with Bobo, they're much more likely to be aggressive if they've seen an adult doing that. So this learning through social observation, imitation, that's a key feature of what Bandura is bringing in. And the other key figure from this time is Aaron or Tim Beck with cognitive therapy, and really again a reaction to the kind of psychoanalytic training that's of psychiatrists in the 50s. Uh, Beck realizes or sort of observes that there are these kind of very key, consistent, kind of like depressogenic thoughts, these kind of thoughts that are associated with folks that are depressed, and they tend to kind of organize this cognitive triad about the world being bad, I'm bad, the future's bad, right? And then hypothesizing that maybe those thoughts are what is maintaining the symptoms of depression. And if we go after those kinds of thoughts, intervene on them, we might be able to help people with depression. So that's the cognitive theory of these emotional disorders. And of course, over time, cognitive therapy goes everywhere. There's CBT for lots of things. Also worth noting that initially it was cognitive therapy, CT, where the behavior comes in a lot of ways is the holdover from that first wave. So the first wave of systematic desensitization, those kind of principles, they come in, they get blended with cognitive therapy to become cognitive behavioral therapy. And so then we have these things like behavioral experiments, and we have exposure-based things, and we have cognitive restructuring, a lot of those things that we associate with second wave CBTs. And again, if we're thinking about these waves of why was there a change, and part of that is that recognition that those first wave behavioral therapies didn't focus particularly much on these kind of private events, these cognitions and things. And so there's this recognition that there's maybe more than just the direct conditioning that we see in the first wave, which is why we get new interest in doing things that have this sort of social component to them, or that have this cognitive component that we didn't really see in first wave interventions. And one thing I want to highlight here is that we'll talk in more detail later about some of the different worldviews, contextualism versus mechanism, but a lot of the CBT interventions in the second wave are basically grounded in a mechanistic assumption about the world, and they really borrow from this the newly developed computer at the time, this idea of kind of the people as computers, where we sort of we have input and we process it, and we have output. And what we have is sometimes we have impaired processing, right? So we have, for example, cognitive distortion. So we have some input from the world, somebody laughs at us, and then we might have cognitive distortions where the output, where we make sense of that, is sort of overgeneralizing or personalizing, in a way that sort of leads us to unhelpful behavior. So the idea is we're processing that input wrong, but if we can work on that and process it better, and find more helpful or more balanced ways of making sense of that, we can block this error in the processing and lead to more helpful outputs, which will then lead to less depression and kind of more functional living. And so you see this really embedded in the language of kind of second wave CBTs. We see like cognitive processing therapy very explicitly about that kind of information um, unit. And so we're going to see later how the contextual view is quite different in making an assumption about how the world is and about what humans are, not in a mechanistic sense, but want to start from acknowledging this, and also really want to acknowledge, even though we're running up to find out about the third wave and all the cool new stuff, I really want to pause for a second and really acknowledge the gift, the strength of the second wave. You think about all the therapies and that have been scaled up in big systems of care across the world, trauma focused CBT and cognitive processing therapy and prolonged exposure and things like this. Like these these saved people's lives and they continue to save lives. These are really things to be proud of. And like any science and any practice, we evolve, and so there were challenges or limitations to these kind of approaches that inspired the third wave. But again, we're going to integrate and keep the things that are really helpful because there's tremendous growth in this era. The other thing I think that's worth noting as just kind of a social or historical determinant here is at the same time that these are being developed, we're also seeing really the prominence of DSM grow. So DSM had been around for a while. The first one is that tiny white one up there, and then in the top that it started quite small. But starting with DSM-3 and then into 4 and 5, there really is this big investment in thinking that maybe these categorical diagnoses of mental health disorders would be really useful. And I think, and as much as we can critique the DSM, and we sure can, I think we also start with recognizing that this started from kind of a good place. There was hope um, that there'd be something really pretty useful that would come out of organizing things in this way. And a lot of what DSM actually is doing is making these things based on overt signs and symptoms and overt behaviors, really trying to, in some ways, get away from the unobservable, psychoanalytic stuff that was in a lot of therapy. So in some ways, early on, DSM is aligned with behavioral therapy and is meant to help. But what really becomes prominent is then a lot of research, a lot of funding, and intervention work is kind of paired to DSM. So Marsha Linehan is a good example. She was interested in the suicidal and parasuicidal uh, uh, challenges that many of the clients that she worked with had, and really wanted to look at that kind of emotional dysregulation, and wasn't necessarily looking to kind of lump that in and call that BPD and have everything be about BPD. But at the time she was developing, dialectical behavioral therapy, right? Like DSM was big, and so finding that connection and having DBTB for borderline personality disorder was really important in terms of getting funding. But it started to create this focus where we became very kind of symptom focus. There's all these different clinical symptoms. Then we start doing these tests, CBT for phobia, CBT for OCD, CBT for psychosis, all that stuff. And we lose the early kind of wholeness of behavior therapy, which was about kind of working with behaviors in context and working with the different kind of clinical manifestations of it, but not being so linked to specific diagnoses. But that did happen in the 1980s and 1990s. There was a lot of this kind of pairing, and so we got a lot of CBT for things, and we learned a lot of things. Um, but it also caused some problems too, and in terms of training, because it's hard to train in CBT for everything and to learn all the different protocols, and we've lost this kind of principle based approach. So part of what the third wave is going to do is sort of react to this and not be so beholden to this idea of protocols for symptoms and be so focused on let's find a disorder and then let's find an intervention to kind of get the symptoms of that disorder under control. And now we are finally ready to talk about the third wave, which runs from about the 1980s to present day. And so, what we usually think about here are the therapies that have kind of an acceptance or mindfulness component. Some of those sort of acceptance strategies in combination with those second wave change strategies, the cognitive reappraisal and behavioral experiment kind of thing. So um, we've got a great cast of characters here. Since we are in Washington right now, I can't help but sort of brag a little bit about how much of this has come from Washington. So we have with ACT, we have Steve Hayes out of Nevada, Reno. We have Kelly Wilson, who came from Gonzaga before he went to Reno. We have Kirk Strassel, who was at University of Washington and did work with Chiles on suicide, did work with Marsha Linehan on DBT. We have Marsha Linehan herself at University of Washington with DBT. We have Bob Kohlenberg and Mavis Tsai, the originators of functional analytic psychotherapy at, you guessed it, the University of Washington. And then one on here that folks may be less familiar with, Neil Jacobson. So Neil Jacobson passed away young, unfortunately, was also at the University of Washington, was doing a lot to bring in contextual approaches to depression and family therapy, and was the founder of integrative behavioral couple therapy. So really a behavioral account of couple therapy that I think would be a lot more well known and a lot better kind of supported had he not died young. So what we have here, we have acceptance and commitment therapy, of course. We have DBT with its focus on acceptance and change, and particularly used for emotion regulation and challenges. Functional analytic psychotherapy is really using a behavioral account of the psychotherapy relationship to make change. It looks in a lot of ways like pretty intense personal therapy, psychodynamic type therapy, but from a strictly behavioral perspective. And then we have some of the ones that wouldn't necessarily, they may or may not say they're part of this sort of CBS tradition, but they are part of this wave because they have this mindfulness component. So things like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. We have a contextual version of behavioral activation that basically came out when they did a dismantling study and realized that a lot of what was helpful in depression wasn't really the cognitive work at all. It really was the behavioral activation part. And so um, this development of really behavioral activation to help people go and sort of build the lives that they that are better, that they want to live, rather than just focusing on working with depressogenic thoughts. That has a modern version now, and as well as metacognitive therapy. So things where you're not necessarily looking at trying to change specific kind of cognitions, but really looking at like how is it that you are thinking, and what are those kind of metacognitive strategies that you're using, and potentially changing them if they're not serving you. So lots of different techniques, lots of different kind of pioneers, but all kind of organized around this idea of acceptance and mindfulness. And so when Steve Hayes was identifying these three different behavior waves, he identified 5 key features that characterize this third wave compared to the previous waves. So the first is that they tend to focus on the context and function rather than the content, so psychological content. And so these aren't just about kind of first order changes, these are about second order changes, looking at those change processes. And as an example, like changing the function of a thought like I am bad through something like cognitive diffusion, rather than trying to replace it with the thought I am good using kind of a challenge through cognitive reappraisal. So this expanded focus on context and function, blending in again the wisdom of the previous wave. So it's not like we're getting rid of cognitive reappraisal there, but rather than using it just for specific pieces of content, we might use it in a more general way to develop cognitive flexibility so that people can respond more flexibly in the face of challenging cognitions rather than focusing on challenging and getting specific cognitions kind of lined up. The other feature seen in these kind of therapies is a focus on broad and flexible repertoires of behavior rather than just on signs and symptoms of specific kind of clinical disorders. So overall, they do this in different ways, but they all kind of have this aim towards helping clients build a life that they want to live, a life worth living, and not just saying let's find ways to kind of manage or get rid of your anxiety or depression. Another characteristic feature of these is the understanding that the processes are applicable to the clinician and not just the client. So sometimes in the ACT context, we like to say we're in the same soup as our clients. Obviously, we don't live their exact lives, we don't have the exact same contexts. But these key biopsychosocial processes, right, that influence psychological flexibility or inflexibility, those are in the mix for all of us. And I don't get any special pass by saying I'm a therapist. I'm not immune to them. They are there for me and they play out in the therapy room, and I need to pay attention to them too, because if I don't, I might end up in some problems with my clinical practice. I might have a hard time kind of holding a space and nurturing psychological flexibility in my client if I can't see it and kind of cultivate it in myself. So in that line, we recognize that self-practice of the principles, mindfulness, if we're doing mindfulness-based therapies, psychological flexibility, if we're doing, ACT, like that self-practice is going to be really important, so that we can bring to life those those pieces in the room with clients. And finally, what kind of characterizes these is that they're going to bring a behavioral lens, right? That kind of desire all the way back from the early 1900s, when behavior therapy was trying to become a natural science of behavior and separate from, psychoanalysis and other things. Holding on to that vision, but bringing it up to deal with the kinds of things that humans deal with. And that includes things like, spirituality and meaning making, purpose in life, and values. And so we need therapies that are able to go there. And behavior therapy had some work to do before it could scale up to that. And so historically, a lot of those kinds of concerns were found more in other kinds of therapies, humanistic, existential, and psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, or those kind of systems perspectives. And so behavior therapy is going there now and trying to bring back ways of caring about all those things that humans care about, but while staying true to the kind of behavioral principles of natural science and empirical, validation, and really making sure that we're held accountable to our change processes in that way. And finally, I want to wrap up by going back to highlight one of the important pieces of the knowledge competency here, which is around this appreciation for how our understanding of human suffering and human flourishing has evolved to try to be more compassionate and flexible and person-centered. And so if we contrast that with the kind of hubris of John Watson's early statement about just give me kids and I'll let them do my thing, and I'll make them, the people that we want. Behavior therapy has had lots of moments of reckoning, right? There's a lot of folks that are aware of some of the harms that have come out of ABA um, when we haven't recognized neurodiversity, when we haven't um, recognized these different kind of marginalized identities, and have put people on a program of sort of trying to be normal, and who gets to decide what is normal, and then we really coach and punish and try to get people to sort of act in the way that we think is best. As the field has matured, I think there's been recognition of those harms and a lot of trying to understand what is our purpose, when do we step in and say, like, yes, this is something that this client wants, this is something that this family wants, this is socially valid, and we can use some of these powerful methods to try to shape behavior, to help people become more of the person that they want and to get what they need in the world, and not just give them kind of the sense that they're doing it wrong or that they're bad, or that our job is to kind of make them conform to um, the way that the world works, which is not, in a lot of times, not very affirming, not very um, nurturing towards letting human beings flourish. So there's always that tension in behavior therapy, and we certainly haven't solved it. But I think there's new approaches, the sort of compassionate ABA approaches, and these moves that we'll see when we get to kind of talking about process-based therapy around really acknowledging and celebrating human diversity, and then asking if we're going to come in and work with people and offer something, does that fit in their context? Is that what they want? And does it help move them towards having more kind of agency and empowerment to make and fight for the lives that they want? Um, so that has been kind of the slow moral arc of behavior therapy as far as I can see. And there's a lot more work to do. So I hope that you will also join us in continuing to have those hard conversations and and build this behavioral science that really is worthy of the human condition.